Okay, so this lesson is on the effects of the Nicaraguan Civil War, and these are mostly short-term effects that happen in the decade following the end of the Nicaraguan Civil War, which ended in 1979. So this mostly talks about the early to mid 1980s, the effects then. It's not really long-term effects. And the essential question is, in what ways and to what extent did the FSLN, which was the Sandinista government that replaced the Somoza government, which fell during the Civil War, the Revolution, how did the FSLN create stability in Nicaragua? And in order to answer the question, it's necessary to first briefly go over the definition of stability regarding to different political, economic, military, and social effects of war. And so political stability would mean little opposition to the government and people having the ability to voice their opinions. Economic stability would mean a strong economy with little dependence on foreign countries. Military would be a strong military that had good organization, and social would be things like adequate living conditions, food supply, welfare for the poor classes, inequality among different groups, which basically means no one group is oppressed. And in order to challenge the question, which you can definitely do for this question in this unit, would be in what ways was Nicaragua unstable with regard to political, economic, military, and social effects of the war? And there were a lot of ways in which it wasn't unstable, so you could really answer the question either way, depending on what you're going to look at. So for political, the FSLN was very good at consolidating power and gaining support throughout the country, and this was beneficial in making the government stable because the government was able to make quick decisions because there wasn't a lot of opposition, so most things were really just one-sided. The DNC formed in 1979, and it was a national directorate. It dictated the institutional structure, defined authority, and the composition of organizational units. It actually proposed a legislative council that included members of political groups that opposed the dictatorship, and it formed a cabinet where conservatives and moderates outnumbered the left. And this just gave the appearance of the left losing influence, even though this wasn't true. The left really did still have the power. They had the bigger positions, and the only reason that they included conservatives and moderates in their cabinet was because they didn't want people to think that they didn't want people to think that the left was completely controlling the government, even though they really were, because they thought that this would cause a lot of opposition among the conservatives and the moderates, which would just cause more trouble for the government. So they thought if that they could keep them happy, it would be a lot better for them. And so the left really did have control over the government. The DNC nationalized export, exploited natural resources and domestic banking, expropriated over 180 industrial and commercial companies, along with 50% of the arable land. And so how did the FSLN continue to control politics even though they had a lot of conservatives and moderates in their cabinet? They had all the control over the military and police forces, which is obviously, if they have control over that, they can have control over whatever they wanted. They prevented conservatives from replacing leftist leadership of popular organizations, which was very important because the FSLN focused a lot on organizing the popular classes under their leadership. They really thought it was important to get the support of the populace, and they also formed alliances with moderate members of the regime, even though the moderates were really radicalized. But they just wanted to make it look like the cabinet included more than just leftist members, which is what I said earlier. But in February 1980, the composition of the cabinet changes. Most of the conservatives were removed, the moderates were radicalized, and more than 9 important positions were held by leftists, which is more than before this. So it shows that the cabinet was starting to get more, starting to shift more towards the left as time went on. And another Council of State was formed in May 1980, and this included 47 members. Popular organizations, which were controlled by the FSLN, received all 47 seats. So this just increased the representation of the Sandinista-led organizations, but it still maintained a pluralistic image because private sector representatives continued to participate. So Even when the FSLN was continuing to gain more power, they still tried to maintain the image that they were including other political views, even though they were not. And as I said earlier, it was very important to the Sandinista government to gain the popular support. So they organized popular classes under their own leadership, and one way they did this was through the CDSs, which were the Sandinista Defense Committees. And the most important functions of these were political and military, even though they did a lot of other things more socially, which I'll talk about later. They worked on gaining support for the revolution, they held meetings to discuss the purpose of the revolution, and they advertised the need to accept the new government leadership. So really their job was to get the people and to get the society to support the new government. And one way they organized another way that the government organized popular classes was through subcommittees on popular organizations. And just to show one way this was done, Nunez was the leader of the proletariat tendency of the FSLN, and this organized workers in the working classes. So there were just different subcommittees that targeted different groups to get different parts of the population involved in supporting the new government. And also, another way that the government gained popular support was through promoting organizations like the Sandinista Youth and the Association of Nicaraguan Women. And so, for the economy in Nicaragua wasn't really good. So it wasn't much stability, although it was actually a little better. It was a little less dependent than before the revolution. But the FSLN the FSLN started a program of state farms and cooperatives, but they replaced this with a program of private entitlement in 1985. And even though a lot of their ideology was more like communist and socialist, which is why the U.S. didn't support them, a lot of historians argue that capitalism wasn't actually removed, it was just restructured, because obviously private entitlement falls under more of capitalism because it's individuals owning it. But there were major economic problems such as production decreasing at an accelerating rate, GNP falling, and a decline in the agro-export income, and agriculture was a huge source of income for them, so that was not good. And they also had a heavy dependence on foreign aid through donations, lines of credits, and loans to be paid off with their product. And in fact, by 1986, Nicaragua owed over $1 billion to foreign countries, which is equal to 4 years of export revenues for them. Military. Okay. The National Guard was replaced with the Popular Sandinista Army, or the EPS, and this was organized around FSLN guerrilla veterans and Sandinista-led popular militias, and the CDSs helped to gain recruits for these militias. And there was also the police and state security forces that were separate from Army, and they were under the Ministry of the Interior. And then more on the Sandinista Popular Militias, or the MPSs, they organized the popular classes and they acted as reserves for the army and auxiliaries. And the DNC kept forces under its direct control, as I said earlier, for politics. And even though the branches were all separate, there was a good connection between all the different branches. For instance, the Military of Interior and the Minister of Defense both participated in DNC and DNC subcommittees on the military, which led to constant communication between the two branches. And the Sandinista veterans held posts in both ministries, or in both the military command and the police command structures. And finally, the EPS, police, and MPS members participated in joint action. So there was obviously a lot of interrelationship between the different branches. And this just shows the relationship of the army under the Sandinista government. So there were political and cultural sections established in all units of the EPS and police forces, because the government felt that the political purpose was important for the armed force, because they felt like all armies should have a political purpose and that there was no apolitical army in the world. And they also wanted to continue to keep the members of the military to support their political cause by refusing offers that the U.S. had to train the military because they thought that the U.S. would just make them disagree with the political message. And the new great the new regime had the necessary power to defend against the three main threats. That should be separate words. So the three main threats were the ex-National Guard units on the Honduran front, and this was dealt with through EPS organized militias. The ultra-leftists under the control of the Workers' Front. And there were two main threats with this, which was strikes against the government and factories and taking money from banks to finance various groups that oppose the new government. And so the defense forces deal with this through the militias being placed in factories to prevent the strikes from escalating and police operations to stop the stealing of money. And then the final threat was the right-wing guerrillas, which wanted to cause a struggle against the new government, and they were stopped by the EPS and the police. So for social, the CDS played a key role in the communities. They improved neighborhood infrastructure, enforced minor ordinances, and implemented public welfare programs. So this kind of created more social stability in a way because they did try to do stuff to help the people, but the living conditions were still pretty poor, which a lot of this was because of the economy. And some other ways the CDS helped was through street cleanings, food distribution, and vaccinations. But really, the CDS's main goal was to try to gather support for the government, and a lot of historians think that they didn't really care what was best for the people, and they just wanted the people to support the government. And there was an improvement in education with the new government. The literacy campaign was launched in March 1980, and during this, secondary students were sent to the countryside to live with people and teach them the basics of reading and writings. And this was this was pretty much mandatory because the students who did not participate could not continue school, or if they were going to graduate, they couldn't graduate. And this also upset parents a lot because they had to send their children to remote parts of the country. And the revolution actually gave women much more equality through associations like the AMPRONAC, and some feminists viewed the revolution as a big step forward for women's equality, and others resented that women were not included in reconstructing society after the revolution. And during the revolution, women ran safe houses, drove vehicles, cared for the wounded, and a third of them were actually armed combatants. So obviously, during the revolution at least, the women had a lot more to do than just work in the households. But like a lot of wars, after the revolution was over, they kind of went back to their normal jobs in the household and just taking care of the kids. So in a way, the effect didn't last very long. So that's everything for the effects of the Nicaraguan Civil War. Oh, the conclusion. So to answer the essential question, so politically, it was initially successful at ridding political opportunity and gaining popular support, but eventually the conservatives at the end did start to realize that they had no real power and started to resent that. And there really was no democracy, and the government was pretty corrupt. And even though it was better than the revolution, it was still pretty bad. The military was actually pretty strong and well organized and was able to defend against foreign threats. Social, there were poor living conditions, but there was progress for women and welfare programs.